Imagine a purpose-built building of red brick and long, airy corridors, its wings fanning out like the ribs of some great, benevolent machine. Picture tall windows, landscaped grounds, fresh air, and the polite echo of footsteps. Now picture the same building decades later, rooms multiplied, windows shuttered, corridors bent under the weight of bodies. Rooms full of people whose names society forgot to keep. This is the story of the 19th century asylum in America. Born of urgent idealism, built in the language of reform and reason, and then consumed by scale, money, fear, and the raw, ordinary cruelty that flourishes when compassion meets bureaucracy. The Victorian Asylum began as a promise. In the first half of the 1800s, Enlightenment ideas about human dignity collided with a social crisis. Industrialization disrupted lives. Immigration surged. War returned injured minds to civilian life. Mental illness was no longer a private misfortune, but a public problem. And so reformers, women and men, shaped by a growing humanitarian impulse, declared that society had a moral duty to help. The mantra of the era was moral treatment. It sounded good in pamphlets, and it sounded better in stone. Calm landscapes, ordered routine, productive labor, occupational therapy, and benevolent guardianship. The asylum was sold as cure rather than custody. A handful of visionaries shaped the American asylum. Dorothea Dix traveled the states with lantern and petition, exposing jails and almshouses where mentally ill people were chained, ignored, and forgotten. Her reports reshaped public opinion and pushed legislatures to fund hospitals. Dr. Thomas Kirkbride drew up architectural plans for humane institutions, long linear wards bathed in light, with windows for fresh air, separate wings so the noisy and the quiet would not torment one another. His name became synonymous with the movement, the Kirkbride Plan. In the most idealized telling, these houses were therapeutic devices, designed to lift the mind by removing it from the violence and moral hazard of urban squalor. For a time, the promise looked real. Early patients sometimes improved. Occupational therapy, gardening, weaving, supervised work offered focus and routine. Diets, exercise, regular sleep, and a less punitive environment could stabilize people who had been traumatized or exhausted. Families found respite. Communities believed in humane progress. The language of psychiatry began to matter. People were no longer possessed or mad in the old sense. The mentally ill were patients, citizens who might be healed. The asylum was, for a while, America's modern temple of mercy. But every institution contains its own dark pressure points. The very features that promised cure concentrated populations, closed systems, expert authority also created the conditions for new abuses. The Kirkbride design that promised fresh air and daylight also made it simple, in the name of therapy, to isolate and to control. The Victorian belief that environment shaped mind hardened into a doctrine. Isolate, manage, and reshape. The asylum that began as a refuge began, in too many places, to look like a warehouse. Money mattered always. Many of the earliest hospitals depended on state funding, counties sending the poor and the troublesome to be housed far away. The promise of cure collided with a budget reality. As more patients arrived, staff numbers did not keep pace. Hospitals designed for a few hundred swelled into thousands. The moral treatment approach, person-centered, time-intensive, could not scale without resources. So what did scale require? Routine, containment, standardized care. The human touch was replaced by routine inspections, forms, and lists. Medical authority compounded the problem. Once psychiatry acquired legitimacy, doctors gathered huge discretionary power. Diagnoses that sounded rational melancholia, mania, hysteria were broad categories. A woman who disagreed with her husband. A man who drank too much and could not hold a job. A veteran with nightmares and flashbacks. Each could be swept into the asylum system. The criteria for admission were elastic. So were the reasons for confinement. In the absence of rigorous forensic or legal protections, families, guardians, or the state might place someone into custody for convenience or control. The promises of moral treatment became an apparatus of social management. Inside the wards, Victorian therapeutic rituals became instruments of order. The same occupational therapies that once restored purpose were sometimes repurposed as unpaid labor. The phrase therapeutic work obscured the fact that patients were doing heavy, repetitive chores that the institution could not otherwise staff. Patients tended livestock, tilled gardens, sewed linens, carried coal indeed. Much of the hospital infrastructure ran on the backs of the incarcerated. There are countless ledger entries describing the value of patient labor, recorded as though the men and women were agricultural output. The image of compassionate reform is complicated by the ledger's blunt arithmetic, profit, procurement, and economies of scale. Treatments themselves reflected the limits of medical knowledge and the darker face of Victorian experimentation. In the name of restoration, patients were subject to hydrotherapy, endless baths or forced immersion, prolonged seclusion, and restrained immobilization. The straitjacket image we now recoil from was for a time a standard device meant to reduce agitation. Cold baths might be called restorative. They could also be cruel. Bloodletting and purging, relics of older medical theories, were employed. Experimental shock techniques appeared. Electric devices were used in some hospitals before their effects were understood. Galvanic stimulation was a crude attempt to stimulate the brain. These practices were often offered with the language of modernity and hope, and occasionally, in certain patients, preliminary improvement was reported ambiguous outcomes that validated continued use. What was especially terrible was the mismatch between public image and private reality. Fundraisers, annual reports, and glossy brochures presented landscaped grounds, artfully arranged patients gardening with smiles. Visiting committees, typically composed of local dignitaries, anxious to show that their tax dollars were well spent, would be led along hand-picked corridors. But behind the curtain, overcrowded dormitories, understaffed wings, the smell of unwashed bodies, vermin, and the dull hum of despair. Where the early reformers had imagined individualized attention, the daily work became triage, putting numbers through the system rather than healing people. Children suffered in their own particular way. The 19th century had few categories for developmental differences. Children who exhibited neurological conditions, learning disabilities, or behavioral problems were often placed in asylums because there were no other options. Reports and private letters recount wards filled with teenagers removed from families, never seen again by relatives who simply lacked legal or financial power to retrieve them. And as urbanization accelerated, the poor and powerless were disproportionately institutionalized, immigrants carrying the stigma of foreignness. Young women whose pregnancy out of wedlock threatened family honor. The elderly whose dementia was then poorly understood and often miscategorized as moral failing. Perhaps the most corrosive practice was involuntary commitment. The legal procedures governing confinement were often shockingly lax. A family could find a way to have a relative certified insane by a local magistrate or physician and then shipped to an asylum with minimal oversight. Once inside, the patient might be released only through complex petitions or court hearings that few families could afford. The combination of medical authority and lax legal protection created a precarious balance where personal liberty could easily be overridden by institutional convenience. Stories abound of quarrelsome wives, inconvenient daughters, or inconvenient dissenters quietly removed to asylums. Hearing these stories in the language of today, we feel anger and disbelief. At the time, the legal and medical culture normalized paternalism. And then there is the matter of death and the afterlife of patients. In the idealized asylum, patients were cared for until recovery. In practice, many died inside these walls, often young. Cemetery pages and hospital ledgers tell a sad litany. Causes of death listed in bureaucratic shorthand: exhaustion, congestion, intestinal complaint, while causes like neglect, poor nutrition, or infection were obscured or euphemized. Burial practices were often utilitarian, unmarked graves or numbered plots. The dead, too, were anonymized. Families were told sullen facts and asked to move on. The institutional imperative to manage the living overshadowed the ritual honoring of the dead. Public outrage did surface periodically. Exposes and investigative journalism began to pull back the veil in the late 19th century. Critical reports by visiting physicians, the press, and sometimes reform-minded politicians exposed squalor and abuse. But the reactions were often partial. Local officials promised reform. Budgets were reallocated in fits and starts. And in some places, real changes did occur. Yet the asylum model concentrated, state-run, custodial remained entrenched for decades. That entrenchment was rarely due to malevolence alone. It was a product of policy choices, resource constraints, cultural fear, and the human tendency to manage categories: who is healthy and who is not, rather than to embrace the messy, expensive work of social integration. I don't say any of this to erase the sincere, even heroic impulses of early reformers. Many doctors and nurses worked with genuine compassion. Many patients did find relief. Many families were grateful. But the full story refuses simplification. The Victorian Asylum in America must be seen as a tragic experiment. Noble ideas constrained by limited knowledge and limited will, producing both relief and suffering on a massive scale. If this pulls at you, if it makes your jaw tighten, ask yourself a question. Who in our modern world is today being placed out of sight in institutions? Whose names will someday be reduced to ledger entries? The history of asylums is not just an artifact. It is a mirror. If you want to keep going, if you want to walk the wards deeper to learn the specific patients, stories, the cruel court cases, the legal reforms that finally emerged, and the way the asylum shaped gender and race under the guise of cure, then stay with me. Comment below where you're watching from. Share this with someone who loves unvarnished history, and hit subscribe. In part 2, we will step inside the wards that became prisons, listen to survivors, accounts, and trace how the moral treatment gave way to custodial care and how ideology hardened into policy that could not be easily undone. When the doors of an asylum closed in the late 19th century, a new world opened behind them. A world organized not by families, but by systems, by schedules, hierarchies, and ever-tightening rules of management. To stand in a Victorian asylum corridor was to stand at the scene where medicine and bureaucracy met. The patient you saw was not only a medical case. He or she was a cog in an institution evaluated, categorized, housed, and recorded. The human face of suffering became data on a page. The transformation from treatment to custody was gradual and almost inevitably bureaucratic. Early moral treatment relied upon individualized attention. The literature of reformists celebrated the idea of order, kindness, engaging patients in purposeful work, and driving away idleness, which was thought to increase distress. But moral treatment demanded time and resources. As numbers of admissions swelled through migration, urban poverty, and broadening definitions of insanity, the time and money were not there. Beds multiplied faster than nurses. Where once a staff member might spend an hour in conversation, now the same staff member was responsible for dozens of patients. The individualized plan was replaced by uniform routines. Uniform routines were enforced by staff whose training varied wildly. Some nurses were former soldiers, some were poorly paid attendants, and some were volunteers. They were often underpaid and overworked. Their power dynamics with patients tilted inevitably toward force when stress levels rose. When disorders escalated or institutions faced outbreaks of disease or unrest, staff relied on simple tools: confinement, restraint, and sedation. The modern horror is that these tools were often justified in the language of care. Take the straitjacket. Designed to immobilize an agitated body, it was used both for brief calming and for prolonged containment. We now recognize that long restraint is not therapy. In the Victorian logic, it was sometimes seen as both therapy and public safety. Seclusion rooms, windowless cells were used to remove the disruptive. Hydrotherapy baths were given for long durations. There are accounts of patients being strapped into chairs for days, or confined in rooms with little light or sensory input, ostensibly to calm nerves. The shocks of deprivation and forced inactivity corroded the mind as much as the mind had been ill in the first place. Doctor-patient relations were asymmetrical to a degree that modern readers might find shocking. A physician's authority rarely faced independent oversight. Patients could be denied access to outside advocates. Families could be warned off. In such a context, errors proliferated. Diagnoses were broad and often gendered. Terms like hysteria, literally derived from Greek for womb, became catch-all explanations for women as complaints. The thin line between dissent and disease was especially dangerous for women. A wife who publicly opposed her husband, a woman who resisted marriageable expectations, or a daughter who asserted independence could be seen as morally or psychologically suspect. Race and class intersected here with brutal clarity. Poor immigrants, especially those who could not navigate the English language bureaucracies or who were unfamiliar to local networks, were vulnerable. Native Americans, too, faced unique vulnerabilities as the nation expanded westward. Colonial encounters often channeled indigenous people into institutions as part of assimilationist projects. Institutionalization could become an instrument used to manage populations deemed socially disruptive. It was easier to remove the problem, to sequester the poor, the addicted, the mentally ill than to fund comprehensive social supports. Abuse came in different modes. Not all were spectacular scandals. Most were grinding indignities. Food rations were often poor. Diets lacked fresh produce and vitamin variety, resulting in scurvy and general malnourishment. Bathing was infrequent. Lice and scabies were endemic. Wards were overcrowded, reducing the secluded therapeutic effect for which these hospitals had been designed. And as populations grew, the pressure to find new uses for old tools increased. Medical experimentation reared its head in ethically questionable ways. Patients could be subjects of tests on sedatives or circulatory treatments with no clear consent recorded. The language of public good sometimes masked the absence of individual consent. One of the most damning aspects was the opacity of accountability. Hospital administrators issued annual reports that pledged improvements and publicized new wings and landscaped grounds, but admissions, discharge rates, and causes of death were often opaque. Visiting committees occasionally discovered horrors, but the response was not always systemic reform. Suffering was in part hidden by grand architecture and official reports that minimized the scale of problems. Political interest waxed and waned. When budgets tightened, the first line item to suffer was staffing, which then fed back into the cycle of neglect. And then came the era of asylum-specific abuse scandals. Papers printed eyewitness testimonies. Former attendants and escaped patients provided blistering accounts. Photographs, rare but potent, captured gaunt faces, vacant gazes, and vast dormitories that looked more like warehouses than healing sanctuaries. Some of these revelations inspired lawsuits, criminal charges, and at least momentary public fury. In some states, reform commissions forced change. Better staffing ratios, improved diets, segregated wards, and more transparent accounting. But reforms were inconsistent. Sometimes they full succeeded. Often they were half measures, blunted by the realities of local politics and the cost of sustained care. Maybe the worst scandal, because it involved the removal of legal protection itself, was the ease of commitment. In some counties, a sworn affidavit from 2 local men and a physician as certificate sufficed to have someone transferred to the public asylum. There were few appeals for those without means, and no requirement for in-person judicial review in many places. This was not uniform across the country. Some states were stricter, some counties were vigilant, but the system was porous enough to be abused. Women's stories are among the most heartbreaking. The Victorian ideal of femininity, pure, domestic, obedient, had sharp edges. A woman who suffered postpartum depression, for example, lived in an era with few legal protections and little sympathy. A husband might consign her to an asylum rather than face scandal. Women who resisted marriage or who were courted by a suitor of the wrong background could find themselves described as morally diseased. Once inside, the treatment was often paternalistic, condescension, enforced inactivity, and silence. The language of gentle persuasion masked coercion. And when these women tried to assert rights or call for release, they faced condescension or, worse, punitive treatments. Children in institutions were another dark subject. No clear, compassionate policy existed for those who lacked family guardians. Orphaned or abandoned children who could not be placed in families were sometimes kept in asylums inappropriately. There they learned no trade. They received little education. The hope that institutions would serve as refuges became a bitter joke. The cumulative effect of all of this was social alienation, not cure. Entire cohorts of people entered the shelter of the asylum and never rejoined civic life. Family structures were undermined. The idea of recovery gave way to custodial logic, housing, feeding, and sometimes sterilizing the population out of sight. In later decades, the eugenic thinking that gained hold in parts of the medical community would draw upon institutional populations, advocating for policies that were chilling in their assumptions. Yet it is necessary to repeat that not all institutions were equally terrible. There were places and individuals who did better work, nurses and attendants who created small worlds of trust and art, doctors who tirelessly sought better options, families who fought to remove their kin and nursed them back to health. The human capacity for kindness survived in pockets. Those stories of compassion are not exceptions to be used as alibis. They are proof that institutional cruelty was a choice policy made by people under pressure, not an inevitability. By the end of the 19th century, the asylum system stood at a crossroads, a reminder of social conscience and a monument to the tragic consequences of underfunded, oversized public institutions. One could see clearly the structural failure. The heroic language of reform had not been paired with the public will to fund meaningful, humane care at scale. The moral treatment experiments had been starved by budgets and replaced by an economy of custody. The machines of good intentions ground into machines of containment. In Part 3, we will trace how the asylum legacy radicalized reform in the 20th century. The legal fights for patient rights, the slow birth of community care, the rise of investigative journalists, and the echoes of those Victorian halls in the institutions that followed. We will tell specific patient stories, voices that survived paperwork and ledgers to reclaim the lives that statistics had buried. We will close by asking what the Victorian Asylum teaches us about care, liberty, and the cost of ignoring the vulnerable. A Victorian asylum left an indelible mark on American social and medical history. Like a wound that never completely heals, its legacy shaped 20th century policies, court decisions, and public attitudes about mental illness, poverty, and state responsibility. The fight that followed was both legal and moral, organized by families, lawyers, journalists, and the occasional sympathetic politician. Let us follow that fight, and then the uneasy path toward reform. Lawyers began to see the asylum as a site of rights violations. Cases emerged that tested the limits of involuntary confinement. As the 20th century began, the courts started to require more rigorous procedures for commitment, judicial review, certification by multiple physicians, and clearer grounds for confinement. At first, these protections were timid, more paperwork than real advocacy, but over time, they became more substantial. Class action suits and public inquiries forced institutions to answer for fires, theft, deaths, and neglect. In court transcripts, depositions would reveal patient names and histories, otherwise lost in dusty files. Journalism played a crucial role. Muckrakers and investigative reporters exposed particularly grotesque conditions in certain hospitals. Newspaper series detailed emaciated patients, unrecorded deaths, and staff brutality. These exposes did not automatically fix the problems, but they shifted public perception. Readers who once saw asylums as remote places of reform began to view them as civic responsibilities, places where taxpayers' money should yield humane care. Public outrage translated into legislative committees, oversight boards, and gradual funding reforms. Parallel to legal and journalistic pressure came an intellectual shift in medicine. The early 20th century saw psychiatry embrace new models: psychoanalysis, biological psychiatry, and later psychopharmacology. These developments mattered because they changed therapy and care models. But they also complicated matters. New treatments were often expensive and controversial. Some were ethically dubious. For institutionalized patients, results varied. In some cases, more humane therapies improved outcomes. In other cases, they provided new rationales for control. Electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, and later lobotomy were used in ways that are now rightly questioned. New tools should have been paired with new safeguards. Sometimes they were not. Community care emerged slowly and haltingly. Asylums had tended to serve a social role: housing, feeding, and keeping the dangerous away. But the idea of integrating people with mental illness into communities grew after World War II. The combination of better medicines, making outpatient management possible, court decisions guarding civil liberties, and economic arguments about the costs of long-term institutional care pushed policy toward deinstitutionalization in the mid-20th century. Large public hospitals emptied out, not always because society had a new compassion, but because the economics of care changed, and because the legal imperative to safeguard individual freedom had gained steam. Deinstitutionalization was noble in intention, but catastrophic in execution in many places. Mental hospitals closed faster than community supports and housing were developed. Patients discharged into unsupported communities often fell through gaps: homelessness, incarceration, and repeated short-term hospitalizations became common outcomes. The reform that sought to restore liberty instead revealed how deeply dependent large swaths of people had become on institutional structures, and how insecure the social safety net had remained. Returning to Victorian legacies, we see both continuity and rupture. The architecture of care, its built environment, staff roles, and binary categories of sane-insane shifted, but many practices lingered. The ease of confinement had to be actively reversed by the law and public scrutiny, and the stigma attached to mental illness, cultivated in part by Victorian narratives of moral failing, required sustained cultural work to undo. One of the most powerful ways to understand the human cost is to listen to patient voices. Records, diaries, letters, petitions survive in many archives. They are patchy, yes, but they sometimes pierce the silence. There are letters home from women pleading innocence, family records of fathers who repurposed their lives to fight for released sons, and testimonials by former attendants who repented their past complicities. These documents show us that history is not only a ledger of abuse, it is a landscape of survival stories. Take the story of a woman admitted in the 1870s after a nervous breakdown. She was recorded as melancholia aggravated by domestic trouble. After decades in beds and behind locked doors, she learned to read again in a small library opened by reformers. She petitioned vigorously. She found friends among other patients who taught her to sew and thus earned small privileges. When she was discharged, at last, she returned to a modest neighborhood, remarried, and took up a trade. Her story is one of several, that do not fit neatly into a narrative of solely victimization. They are complicated lives of constraint and agency, of harm and resilience. Another human cost was the impact on families. The social practice of sending a relative to an asylum often fractured families for generations. The shame and silence around mental illness meant fewer family members visited, fewer letters were written, and the relational threads frayed. The sociology of entire communities changed. Neighborhoods that housed large institutions sometimes developed dependent economies. When reforms closed those hospitals, towns faced deep economic and social shifts. In the museum spaces and historic tours of old Kirkbride buildings, visitors see the elegant facades and the sweeping lawns. Some are now hotels or university buildings. Others are derelict skeletons covered in ivy. Standing before one, you feel the weight of contradictions, noble intentions, and terrible consequences. Architecture meant to cure, that also made it easy to hide. A society that believed itself enlightened, but functioned with elites' interests in mind. So what lessons, finally, should we take from the Victorian Asylum? First, that progressive ideas require progressive resources. Moral treatment promised individualized care, then our politics shortchanged the moral claim by refusing to fund it. Second, that medical authority must be balanced by legal safeguards. The ease with which liberty can be curtailed in the name of treatment is unnerving. Robust procedural protections are essential. Third, that institutional solutions alone are insufficient. The real work happens in communities. Schools, workplaces, housing, supportive services that allow people to live with dignity. And last, we must remember the human names behind institutional histories. Behind each ledger line, there was a person, someone who loved, suffered, hoped, and sometimes survived. The Victorian Asylum is not simply an old and ugly chapter in American history. It is a live memory that still influences debates about how we care for the vulnerable, how we balance liberty and care, and how we spend our public money. It asks us to confront a central question. Do we want to hide our suffering or to meet it openly and in community? The difference between those choices is the difference between human dignity and bureaucratic erasure. As you leave this story, if it leaves you with discomfort, anger, or sorrow, hold to the thought that reform is not a single act, but a sustained practice. The people who once walked the corridors of those red brick asylums would want us not merely to remember them as victims, but to commit to a future in which care and liberty move forward together, funded and protected, so that no generation repeats the tragedies of the past.